When Margaret Hayes inherits a barren farm everyone said was cursed, she discovers something buried beneath the lifeless earth that will shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about loss, resilience, and the invisible forces that shape our destiny. What begins as a widow's last desperate attempt at survival becomes a journey into the extraordinary, a discovery so profound it will change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who dared to dismiss her. Stay until the end to witness the revelation that turns hopelessness into something miraculous. If this story moves you, please like this video and subscribe for more transformative narratives that remind us what it means to be truly alive. The morning Margaret Hayes arrived at Thornfield Farm, the sky wore the color of old bruises, purple fading into gray, as if the heavens themselves were nursing wounds time had failed to heal. She stood at the rusted gate, with a single suitcase in her left hand and a folded letter in her right. The paper soft from too many readings, the ink beginning to blur where her tears had fallen during sleepless nights. Behind her, the taxi that had brought her from the bus station was already disappearing down the dirt road, leaving only a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a departing spirit. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, that whispers of abandonment and endings. The farm stretched before her in shades of defeat. 40 acres of cracked earth, skeletal trees that clawed at the sky with brittle fingers, and a farmhouse that sagged under the weight of its own neglect. The fields were a graveyard of failed harvests, the soil so pale it looked bleached, as if something essential had been drained from it long ago. Even the fence posts leaned like mourners at a funeral, their wood weathered to the gray of old bones. Margaret had seen photographs, of course. Her late husband's brother had sent them with apologetic efficiency, but photographs, she realized now, could not capture the feeling of a place. They could not convey the heaviness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, or the way the wind carried whispers of all the dreams that had died here before hers even began. She was 53 years old, though grief had aged her in ways the mirror had only begun to acknowledge. 3 months earlier, David had collapsed in their small apartment's kitchen, a massive coronary that stole him between one breath and the next, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and a future that had vanished like smoke. The funeral had taken their savings. The medical bills had taken everything else. When a letter arrived from David's brother Thomas, awkward condolences wrapped around a strange inheritance. She had read it 7 times before believing it was real. Thomas had owned Thornfield Farm for 2 decades, but had never worked it, never even visited after the first year. The land is difficult, he had written in his careful accountant script. Everyone who's tried to farm it has failed. But it's yours now if you want it, Margaret. I know you have nowhere else to go. He had not meant it cruelly, she thought, but the words had carved themselves into her heart nonetheless. Nowhere else to go. It was true. Her sister had offered a couch in Phoenix, but the offer had been wrapped in the kind of pity that makes charity feel like humiliation. Her daughter Sarah had a spare room in Seattle, but Sarah had 3 children and a husband who looked at Margaret like she was a burden waiting to happen. So she had come here, to this place of last resort, to this farm that everyone said was cursed, poisoned, dead. She had come because sometimes when all your bridges burn, you walk forward into the smoke simply because there's no other direction left. The gate's hinges screamed as she pushed it open, a sound like something in pain, and Margaret felt a strange tremor move through her chest. Not quite fear, not quite recognition, but something older than both. It was the feeling you get when standing at the edge of a cliff, when your body knows before your mind does that you're about to fall. She looked down at the letters still clutched in her right hand, Thomas's final words visible in the fold. The land has been waiting for something. I don't know what. Maybe it's been waiting for you. At the time, she had dismissed it as the poetic nonsense of a man who felt guilty for inheriting something he'd never wanted. But standing here now, with the dead earth stretching away in all directions and the weight of the silence pressing down like a physical thing, Margaret wondered if perhaps the land could wait, if perhaps it could want, and if perhaps, though this thought made her hands shake slightly, it could also hunger. The farmhouse interior smelled of dust and decades, of lives half-lived and suddenly abandoned. Margaret's footsteps echoed on the wooden floors, each sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive quiet that filled every room like standing water. Sheets covered furniture she couldn't remember Thomas ever describing, their white surfaces gray with neglect, ghost-like shapes that seemed to watch her as she moved from room to room. The kitchen sink dripped with metronomic persistence, each drop a small declaration of time passing, indifferent to her presence or her pain. She set her suitcase down in what had once been a bedroom and sat on the bare mattress, springs groaning beneath her weight. And for the first time since David's death, she allowed herself to cry without restraint. The tears came from a place deeper than sorrow, from the well of exhaustion that grief digs in the center of your being. She cried for the life she'd had, modest but filled with small joys. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, hands held during evening walks, the sound of David's laughter when she told a joke badly. She cried for the future she'd imagined, the retirement they'd planned, the grandchildren they'd hoped to spoil, the garden she'd wanted to plant behind their apartment building. She cried for the woman she'd been just 3 months ago, before the world proved how quickly everything solid could dissolve. And when the tears finally subsided, leaving her hollow and wrung out like old cloth, she cried once more because she realized she had nothing left to lose, which meant she had nothing left to protect herself with. The first week passed in a blur of basic survival. She cleaned the house with a thoroughness born of desperation, scrubbing away layers of abandonment, as if cleanliness could somehow sanctify the space, make it feel less like a tomb. She discovered Thomas had left supplies in the pantry, canned goods, rice, dried beans, enough to last several months if she was careful. The well water ran brown for the first day, then cleared to something drinkable, if not quite trustworthy. At night, she lay in the darkness listening to the house settle around her, its creaks and groans like the breathing of some vast creature, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But where else could she have gone? Nowhere. Nowhere. The word became a mantra that justified every choice, every surrender. On the 8th day, she forced herself to walk the property. The fields stretched away in all directions, divided by crumbling stone walls that someone had built generations ago with hands now dust. The soil, when she knelt to touch it, felt wrong. Not just depleted, but somehow inert, as if the essential spark that allows things to grow had been extinguished. She lifted a handful and let it fall through her fingers, watching it cascade down in a pale stream. No earthworms, no insects, no sign of the teeming life that should exist in healthy ground. She remembered reading once that a handful of healthy soil contained more organisms than there were people on Earth. This soil contained nothing. It was less like earth and more like ash, the residue of something burned beyond recognition. Margaret had never been a farmer. She'd been an elementary school teacher for 30 years, had spent her life in classrooms teaching children to read and calculate and dream. But she'd grown up with grandparents who gardened, had absorbed through childhood observation the basic rhythms of planting and tending. More than that, she carried a stubbornness David had always teased her about, a refusal to accept defeat that had driven her through college when money was scarce and through the early years of teaching when she questioned her choice every day. If the land was sick, she would heal it. If the soil was dead, she would resurrect it. She had no other purpose left, no other fight to wage. This would be her battle, this reclamation of barren ground, and if she lost, then at least she would lose trying. The town of Millbrook lay 6 miles down the main road, a collection of weathered buildings arranged around a single stoplight that blinked yellow at all hours. Margaret walked there on her 9th day at the farm, unwilling to spend money on taxi fare. Her legs aching by the time she reached the feed store at the town's edge. Inside, a man in his 70s looked up from behind a counter stacked with seed catalogs, his face mapping surprise and something else, recognition, though they'd never met. "You're Margaret Hayes," he said, not quite a question. "I am." She tried to smile, but it felt wrong on her face, a muscle memory her grief had overwritten. "How did you know? Town this size, word travels. You're living out at Thornfield." He said the name like it tasted bad. Thomas's place. My place now, she corrected gently. The old man studied her with eyes that had seen too many seasons pass, too many hopes planted and harvested and ultimately buried. You planning to farm it? I'm planning to try. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough, then shook his head slowly. Ma'am, I mean no disrespect, but that land's been dead for 20 years or more. Before Thomas had it, the Richardsons tried. Before them, the Kowalskis. Before them, others whose names I've forgotten. All of them failed. Something about that soil just doesn't want to give life. Then I'll give it no choice, Margaret said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. The old man studied her a moment longer, then shrugged. Your money to waste. What do you need? She bought bags of compost, fertilizer, a dozen packets of vegetable seeds, tomatoes, beans, squash, lettuce. She bought a spade and a hoe, work gloves that were too large, and a book on organic farming written for beginners. The old man helped her load everything into a wheelbarrow he loaned her as she walked the 6 miles back pushing it, the wheels squeaking rhythmically, her shoulders burning. By the time she reached Thornfield, the sun was setting, painting the dead fields in shades of amber and blood. She stood at the gate looking at her purchase, at the bags of hope and denial stacked in the wheelbarrow, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite belief, but perhaps its distant cousin, defiance. The next morning, she chose a plot near the house, a square of ground perhaps 20 feet on each side. She worked the soil with a spade, breaking up the hard-packed earth, finding it fought her with every thrust of the blade. Sweat soaked her shirt despite the cool autumn air. Her hands blistered inside the oversized gloves. She worked through the pain, through the voice in her head that whispered she was a fool, through the memory of David's eyes closing for the last time. She dumped the compost and mixed it with the native soil, worked in the fertilizer according to the package directions, raked the plot smooth. By afternoon, her back screamed and her hands bled through broken blisters, but the plot was ready. She planted in rows, following the instructions on the seed packets with almost religious precision. Tomatoes along the back where they'd receive the most sun. Bush beans in the middle. Lettuce and squash toward the front. She covered each seed with the exact depth of soil specified, patted it down gently, whispered to it words she couldn't have explained fast. Please, she said to the covered seeds. Please grow. Please try. I need you to try. It was absurd, talking to seeds like they were children who needed encouragement, but she found she didn't care. Absurdity was a luxury she could no longer afford. She needed belief in something, even if that something was as small and fragile as a seed buried in hostile ground. She watered the plot with the well water, the liquid darkening the pale soil, seeping down toward the waiting seeds. Then she stood back, leaning on her spade, and looked at what she'd done. It didn't look like much, just a square of slightly darker earth marked with a few small plant markers she'd made from popsicle sticks. But it was something. An act of creation in a landscape of death. A declaration that she still had the capacity to hope, even if that hope was irrational, even if it was doomed. The days that followed established a rhythm that kept despair at bay. She woke with the sun, checked her plot for any sign of germination, tended to the house and her meager supplies, then returned to the plot to weed, water, watch. She walked to town twice more that first month, buying more supplies, more seeds, enduring the pitying looks from the hardware store clerk, the pharmacist, the woman at the small grocery. She didn't care. Let them pity her. She'd survived worse than pity. She'd survived the absolute extinction of her future, the death of her marriage and her career and her purpose. If she could survive that, she could survive their knowing glances and sympathetic head shakes. 3 weeks after planting, the first sprouts appeared. Margaret discovered them on a morning when frost had silvered the dead fields around her plot, the pale light of dawn turning everything ghostly. She'd been walking toward her garden with a bucket of water, not expecting anything. The seed packets had said germination would take 4 to 5 weeks in poor soil when she saw them. Tiny green shoots, delicate as whispers, breaking through the dark earth. Her breath caught. She set down the bucket and knelt, not caring that the frozen ground bit through her thin pants. She counted 7 bean shoots, 3 tomatoes, a scattering of lettuce. It wasn't much. It shouldn't have felt like a miracle. But her hands shook as she touched one sprout, feeling the impossible texture of life against her fingertip. "You're here," she whispered. "You came." She watered them with trembling hands, then sat beside the plot as the sun rose higher, warming her face, casting long shadows across the fields. For the first time since David's death, she felt something other than hollow. She felt needed. These fragile lives depended on her, required her attention and care. They gave her a reason to wake, to continue, to survive another day. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The plants grew, though not quickly and not with the vigor she'd hoped for. They pushed upward with what seemed like enormous effort, their leaves often yellowed at the edges, their stems thin and uncertain. She fed them according to the book's instructions, watered them religiously, checked them for pests. The nights grew colder as October became November. She covered the tender plants with old sheets when frost threatened, uncovered them each morning, counting the survivors. Some died, more than some, but enough lived to keep her going, to justify the ache in her back and the cuts on her hands. On a gray afternoon in mid-November, she was weeding around the base of a tomato plant when her fingers brushed against something hard beneath the soil. At first, she thought it was a rock. The land was full of them, stubborn stones that had broken 2 of her hoe handles already. But as she dug around it, clearing away the pale earth, she realized it was something else. Something smooth and regular. Something that shouldn't be there. She excavated carefully, her heart beginning to pound for reasons she couldn't name. The object revealed itself slowly. A small box, metal by the feel of it, perhaps 6 inches long and 4 wide. She lifted it from the ground with both hands, soil cascading off its surface, revealing intricate engravings on the lid. Her breath came faster. She brushed away more dirt, and in the fading afternoon light, she could make out what looked like symbols. Not letters exactly, but marks that suggested meaning, patterns that pulled at something deep in her vision, making her eyes want to follow them in circles. She should have opened it there in the garden, but some instinct made her wait. She carried the box into the house, set it on the kitchen table, and stood staring at it while her heartbeat slowly returned to normal. It was just a box. Someone had buried it, perhaps decades ago. It probably contained nothing. Old coins, maybe, or keepsake a child had hidden and forgotten. Nothing of value. Nothing of importance. But her hand still shook when she finally worked the catch open and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in cloth that crumbled at her touch, was a book. Not an old book, or not old in the way she'd expected. The leather binding was worn, but not deteriorated. The pages yellowed, but intact. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it, the way it seemed to pulse with something she couldn't quite name. When she opened to the first page, she found handwriting, precise, elegant script in ink that had faded to brown. A date, 1873. And beneath it, a name, Eleanor Ashford. Margaret sat down heavily, the book in her lap, and began to read. Eleanor Ashford's journal opened not with explanation, but with desperation. The first entry, dated March 15th, 1873, contained just 3 sentences. "I have come to the place they say is cursed. If I cannot make it live, I will die trying. There is nothing left for me anywhere else." Margaret felt those words in her chest, a recognition so profound it made her hands tremble. She was reading across 150 years, but she was reading her own heart. The journal entries came in bursts, sometimes daily, sometimes with weeks between. Eleanor's handwriting varied, neat and controlled when she felt strong, sprawling and desperate when she didn't. She'd been 28 when she arrived at the land that would become Thornfield Farm, fleeing a tragedy the early entries only hinted at, the fever that took mother, father, and James within a week, the creditors who took everything else, the man who said he'd marry me if only I were less difficult. She'd purchased the land with the last of an inheritance she'd hidden from creditors, 40 acres no one else wanted because nothing would grow there. "The soil is like ash," Eleanor wrote in an April entry. "When I dig, I find no worms, no beetles, no sign that anything has lived here. The previous owner told me the natives avoided this place, said it had been poisoned by some great wrong. I don't believe in such superstitions, but I confess the silence here unsettles me. It is not the silence of peace, but of absence, as if something essential has been removed. Margaret read by lamplight, the November wind rattling the farmhouse windows, occasionally glancing up at the darkness pressing against the glass. She should stop, make dinner, tend to her chores. But Eleanor's words had hooked themselves into her, pulling her forward through the pages. Eleanor had tried to farm conventionally at first. She planted corn, wheat, vegetables. Everything failed. The seeds germinated, then withered, as if the earth actively rejected them. She consulted neighbors who shook their heads and told her to give up. She wrote to agricultural colleges, received polite letters explaining soil chemistry in terms that didn't help. She spent her dwindling money on fertilizers that made no difference. By winter of her first year, she was eating the last of her supplies and writing entries that bordered on incoherent. The land is hungry. I don't mean it lacks nutrients. I mean it hungers. I can feel it at night, a wanting that presses against the walls. Then, on February 3rd, 1874, the tone changed abruptly. Something remarkable happened today. I was so weak from hunger I could barely stand. I knelt in the garden plot and wept, truly wept, not politely but with the raw grief I've been holding since I buried my family. My tears fell on the barren earth, and I said aloud, I have nothing left to give you. I have tried everything. Please, if you can hear me, if you are anything more than dead ground, tell me what you need. I know how mad that sounds. I was speaking to dirt, but I was past caring about madness. And here's the mad part. I felt something respond. Margaret's breath caught. She read the paragraph again, then continued. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't words. It was more like a knowing that appeared in my mind. The land was showing me what it needed, though I hardly dare write it for fear of what it means about my sanity. It showed me roots going deep, deeper than I'd imagined, reaching down to somewhere dark and wounded. It showed me water, not rain but tears, salt and sorrow seeping into the ground. And it showed me seeds, but seeds that had been held in a palm, warmed by human hand, spoken to, blessed with intention. I don't understand it, but I'm desperate enough to try. The entries that followed documented Eleanor's experiment. She collected rainwater in barrels, but before using it, she would hold the bucket and speak to the water. Not prayers exactly, but expressions of need, hope, gratitude. She held seeds in her palm each morning, warming them, telling them what she hoped they would become. Before planting, she walked the plot barefoot, letting her feet touch the soil, trying to feel what Eleanor described as the heartbeat underneath, faint but present, like something sleeping that wanted to wake. The neighbors would think me a witch if they saw, she wrote. Perhaps I am, but I no longer care what I'm called if something will finally grow. And grow things did. By spring of 1874, Eleanor's garden erupted with life. Tomatoes grew large as my fist and sweet as honey. Beans climbed higher than my head, producing more than I can eat or preserve. The soil itself began to change, darkening, softening, showing signs of the living ecosystem it had lacked. Earthworms appeared, beetles and spiders. Birds came to hunt the insects, and their droppings enriched the ground further. I don't know what I've done, Eleanor wrote in July. I only know the land is no longer silent. I can feel it now, especially at dawn and dusk, a presence, aware and watchful. It doesn't frighten me as it once did. It feels like loneliness recognizing loneliness, reaching across a void to touch. Margaret set the journal down, her hands numb, her mind reeling. This was impossible. Soil was soil, minerals and organic matter, chemistry and physics. You couldn't wake it up by crying into it. You couldn't make things grow by talking to seeds. It was absurd, the fantasy of a desperate woman who'd convinced herself her emotional state affected her garden success. And yet, Margaret had cried into her own plot. She had whispered to her seeds. She had, though she'd barely admitted it to herself, sometimes stood barefoot in the early morning on the dark earth, feeling its texture against her soles, thinking not quite thoughts that felt like attempts at communication. She dismissed it as grief madness, the irrational behavior of a woman who'd lost everything. But what if Eleanor had discovered something real? What if the land truly was something more than dirt and minerals? She thought of her struggling plants, how they grew despite the poor soil, despite the late season, despite every rational reason they should fail. She thought of the box buried exactly where her hands would find it, as if placed there deliberately, waiting. For her? For someone like her? For anyone desperate enough to try what Eleanor had tried. Margaret picked up the journal again, her hands steadier now, and read deeper into the night. Eleanor's success had drawn attention. Neighbors who'd pitted her came to marvel at her garden, to ask her secret. She tried to explain, writing, "When I tell them the truth, that I speak to the earth, that I give it not just water and fertilizer, but attention, intention, grief, and gratitude, they laugh or look away uncomfortably. They think I'm being poetic or mad. So I've learned to say vague things about organic methods and crop rotation, and they nod and go away satisfied." But not everyone dismissed her. A few came back, alone, asking quieter questions. Eleanor began teaching, though she wrote with frustration about how difficult it was to convey. "I tell them to speak to the seeds, and they recite words like incantations, thinking the specific phrases matter. But it's not about words. It's about the feeling behind them, the genuine reaching out to something other than yourself. Most people have forgotten how to do that. They've forgotten that the world is alive in ways we've stopped noticing." By 1875, Eleanor's farm was thriving. She sold produce to neighboring towns, hired workers to help with harvest, expanded her garden to several acres. She married a man named Samuel who thought her methods peculiar but effective. They had 2 children. The farm prospered for a decade. Then, in April of 1885, a single entry read, "Samuel is dead. Accident with the plow horse. The children are with his family. I'm alone again." The entries after Samuel's death grew sparse, painful to read. Eleanor buried herself in work, expanded the farm further, drove herself to exhaustion. But something had broken in her. "The land still responds to me," she wrote, "but my heart is so hollow I can barely feel it anymore. I give it my attention, but I have no joy left to offer. The crops grow, but they taste of ash to me now." Margaret recognized that hollowness. She knew exactly what Eleanor meant. The journal's final entries were dated autumn of 1886. Eleanor wrote of feeling tired, of coughing blood, of knowing her body was failing. "I don't regret coming here," one of the last entries read. "This land gave me life when I had none. It gave me purpose, connection, a reason to wake each morning. I only wish I could have understood it better, could have written down clearly what I learned. But some knowledge doesn't translate into words. Some knowledge has to be felt directly, bone to earth." The final entry was dated October 29th, 1886. Just 3 lines in handwriting so shaky Margaret could barely read it. "I'm burying this where someone will find it someday. Someone who needs what I needed. The land will call them when the time is right. Tell them not to be afraid. Tell them the earth remembers everything we give it." Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know if she was crying for Eleanor or for herself or for the strange resonance between their lives separated by a century and a half. She only knew that something had shifted inside her, a door opening to a possibility she'd never considered. What if the world was alive in ways she'd forgotten to notice? What if grief and attention and intention had power beyond the merely psychological? What if Eleanor had been right and the land didn't just receive what you gave it, but actually responded, actually reached back, actually participated in the act of growing? She thought of quantum physics, how observation affects outcomes. She thought of studies showing plants responding to sound, to human presence. She thought of ancient practices, indigenous ceremonies, blessing of crops, the idea that land had to be honored, not just used. Modern agriculture had dismissed all that as superstition, had reduced growing to chemistry and mechanics. But what if the mechanistic view was incomplete? What if Eleanor had stumbled on as something science had forgotten in its rush to quantify and control? Margaret stood, walked to the window, looked out at her small plot of struggling plants barely visible in the darkness. The rational part of her mind screamed that she was being ridiculous, that she was letting a desperate woman's journal trigger her own desperation. But beneath the rational voice was something quieter, older, more certain, a whisper that felt like recognition. She had cried into this earth. She had spoken to her seeds, and they had grown against all odds. Maybe that meant nothing, or maybe it meant everything. She put on her coat and walked outside, the November cold biting through her clothes. She stood at the edge of her plot, the frozen ground hard beneath her feet. The stars overhead were brilliant, unfiltered by city light, vast and indifferent. She knelt on the frozen earth, placed her palms flat against it, and closed her eyes. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said aloud, her voice shaking. "I don't know if you're real or if I'm just talking to dirt. But Eleanor believed in you, and I need to believe in something. So I'm asking, what do you need from me? What does this land need to truly heal?" She felt foolish. She felt crazy. But she stayed kneeling, palms pressed to the ground, breathing slowly, waiting, hoping, desperate for any sign that she wasn't alone, that the universe contained more than the cold mechanism her grief had revealed. And then, at first, she thought it was her imagination. A warmth, faint but present, spreading from the ground into her palms. A sense not of words, but of feeling, of communication too subtle for language. Not a voice, but an impression. Thirst. Not physical thirst, but something deeper. A hunger for attention, for connection, for the kind of care Eleanor had given before grief had hollowed her out. Margaret's breath caught. Her eyes flew open, but she saw nothing different, just frozen ground, struggling plants, the vast, empty night. But the warmth remained in her palms, and with it a knowing that felt like memory. This land had been wounded somehow, long ago, had been neglected and abandoned and used up, had been treated as dead for so long it had nearly forgotten how to live. It needed more than water and fertilizer. It needed what Eleanor had given it: witness, presence, the kind of attention that says, you matter, you are seen, you're not alone. Tears froze on Margaret's cheeks as she finally understood what the journal had been trying to tell her. Eleanor hadn't made things grow through magic or special words. She'd made things grow by remembering how to relate to the earth as a living presence, not a resource. By giving it the one thing modern life had taught everyone to withhold: genuine attention, freely given, without expectation or control. Margaret pressed her forehead to the frozen ground and wept. Not from sorrow this time, but from a relief so profound it felt like resurrection. She had found it, the thing she needed without knowing she needed it. Not answers, not explanations, but connection. Proof that even in her loneliness, even in her grief, she was part of something larger, something that responded when called, something that remembered. "I see you," she whispered to the earth. "I'm here. I won't leave you alone." And though it might have been the wind or the beating of her own heart, she could have sworn she felt an answer. A pulse of warmth, brief but unmistakable, like a hand squeezing hers in the dark. Winter arrived with teeth bared. Snow fell in late November, burying Margaret's plot beneath 6 inches of white silence. The temperature plummeted, turning the farmhouse into a cavern of cold drafts and frozen pipes. She spent her days wrapped in blankets, feeding the wood stove pieces of fence she'd scavenged, rationing her supplies with mathematical precision. The town felt further away than 6 miles. The entire world felt further away. But somehow, the isolation didn't crush her the way she'd expected. She had the journal, and she had a purpose that had begun to consume her. Every morning, regardless of the cold, Margaret bundled herself in layers and went out to her buried garden. She'd clear snow from a small section of the plot, kneel on the frozen ground, and place her bare hands against the earth. She spoke to it, not formal words or prayers, just thoughts shared aloud. She told it about David, about the life they'd built, about the morning he died, and how the world had fractured. She told it about her fears, her loneliness, her desperate hope that Eleanor's discovery had been real. And she listened in the way Eleanor had described, not with ears but with some deeper sense, trying to feel the land's response beneath the winter silence. At first, she felt nothing but cold, but she persisted, driven by something that felt less like belief and more like stubbornness refined to its essence. If Eleanor had been right, if the land truly responded to attention, then winter was when it needed attention most. When everything appeared dead, when the surface offered no evidence of life, that was precisely when witness mattered most. Slowly, over the course of December, she began to sense something. It was subtle, easily dismissed as imagination, but Margaret had stopped caring whether she was imagining it or not. There was a presence beneath the frozen ground, a slow pulse like breathing at the edge of sleep. Sometimes when she knelt there, hands freezing against the earth, she felt what she could only describe as gratitude. Not her gratitude, but something else's, something vast and patient, and so lonely it made her chest ache. She started bringing offerings, not because the journal mentioned it, but because it felt right. Eggshells crushed and scattered on the snow. Coffee grounds. Her own hair when she trimmed it. Scraps from her meager meals, returned to the earth instead of burned or thrown away. Everything came from you, she told the ground. Everything returns. I want you to know I remember that. The neighbors, the few times she saw them, treated her with a particular gentleness reserved for lost causes. The old man at the feed store gave her discounts he never acknowledged, pricing things lower than the tags indicated. The woman at the grocery slipped extra cans into her bags when she thought Margaret wasn't watching. They were being kind, she knew, preparing for the inevitable failure, the eventual foreclosure, the day she'd leave like everyone else who tried to make Thornfield work. But Margaret had stopped believing in inevitable failure. She'd seen Eleanor's impossible garden in her mind, had read the woman's accounts of transformation. If Eleanor could wake this land from sleep, so could she. She had less knowledge but equal desperation, and perhaps desperation was the essential ingredient all along. On Christmas Eve, Margaret sat alone in the farmhouse with a single candle burning, listening to wind rattle the windows. She'd called her daughter Sarah that morning, a conversation that had hurt in its careful politeness, in Sarah's obvious desire to extend help without having to actually extend it, in a reality that they'd never been close and grief had made the distance greater. She called her sister in Phoenix, heard grandchildren shrieking in the background, felt the relief in her sister's voice when Margaret said everything was fine. She wasn't coming. She was settled. They were good people, her family. They just had no room for her particular kind of broken. She took Eleanor's journal, which she'd been carrying everywhere like a talisman, and read random entries by candlelight. Eleanor writing about her first harvest. The tomatoes tasted like joy remembered. I cried while eating them. Eleanor writing about teaching her children. I showed them how to hold seeds, how to bless them with attention. Samuel thinks I'm filling their heads with nonsense. But I see how they look at the garden, not as a resource, but as a relationship. That matters. Eleanor writing about loneliness. Even surrounded by family, I sometimes feel hollow. Only the land fills that emptiness. Only in the garden do I feel whole. Neighbors began to notice. In April, the old man from the feed store drove out, ostensibly to check if she needed supplies. He stood at the edge of her garden, mouth slightly open, staring at growth that shouldn't exist in soil that had been dead. "Ow," he finally said, not quite a question. Margaret considered her answer carefully. If she told the truth, he'd think her insane. If she lied, she'd dishonor Eleanor's discovery. She chose a middle path. I'm following methods I learned from a journal. The woman who wrote it farmed this land in the 1800s. She had success here when no one else did. What methods? The old man pressed. Attention, Margaret said simply. She taught the land that someone cared again. He looked at her oddly, but didn't argue. He drove away, and Margaret knew he'd tell others. Let him. She'd stopped caring what people thought. She had plants that needed tending, and earth that had become something close to friend. By May, her garden was producing. She harvested lettuce, radishes, early peas. The vegetables tasted like Eleanor had described, impossibly sweet, vital, as if they contained more than mere nutrients. She ate salads that made her weep, not from sorrow but from a joy she'd forgotten existed. Food that tasted like hope remembered. She took a basket of produce to town, traded it at the grocery for supplies. The grocer's wife held a tomato up to the light, turned it in her palm. "I've never seen one like this." "What variety?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I just planted what was in the seed packet. But the soil is special." Word spread. By June, people were driving out to see the impossible garden at Thornfield Farm, the place where nothing had grown for generations. They came skeptical and left confused, unable to reconcile what they'd been told about the land with what they were seeing. Some asked to buy produce. Margaret sold it, accepting whatever they offered, needing the money but also needing to share what the land had given her. A few asked her secret. She always told them the truth, or as much of it as she could explain. Talk to your plants. Not with just words, but with attention. Let your garden know it matters to you. Some nodded politely and left. But others, the desperate ones, the lonely ones, the ones who'd lost something essential, they understood. Their eyes lit with recognition, and they'd ask more questions, and Margaret would share what Eleanor had taught her, passing the knowledge forward as it had been passed to her. One woman in particular kept returning, a young mother named Claire whose husband had died the previous year, leaving her with 2 children and a foreclosed farm 3 miles down the road. She came first to buy vegetables, then to ask questions, then finally to confess. "I thought I was going crazy. I've been talking to my houseplants since Tom died. They're the only things that don't look at me with pity." Margaret gripped her hand. "You're not crazy. Or if you are, I am too. Come here tomorrow morning. Bring your children. I'll show you what I've learned." She began teaching, not formally, but in the way Eleanor had, one desperate person at a time, sharing what couldn't quite be put into words. She taught them to walk their ground barefoot, to hold seeds before planting, to speak not with expectation but with attention, with the kind of focused awareness that allowed relationship to form. Some got it immediately. Others struggled, too trapped in their own heads, too convinced the world was mechanical and dead. She could only offer the method. The understanding had to come from direct experience. By July, Margaret's garden had become legendary. Farmers from 50 miles away drove out to see it, to argue about what she was doing, to insist there had to be a rational explanation. She let them take soil samples, which revealed nothing unusual. Adequate nutrients, good structure, but nothing that explained the explosive growth. She let them take plant samples, which were tested and found to be genetically normal. The mystery remained, and Margaret was glad. Some things couldn't be reduced to data. Some things had to be experienced to be believed. She hired Claire to help with harvest, paying her with produce and teaching. Together they worked the garden in the golden light of summer evenings, talking about loss and survival and the strange consolation of green growing things. Claire brought her children, and Margaret taught them Eleanor's methods, watched them learn to listen to the earth with the unself-conscious openness of the young. "You're going to change their lives," Claire said one evening. "The land is changing their lives," Margaret corrected. "I'm just remembering what we all forgot." But even as the garden thrived, Margaret felt something shifting, a restlessness in the earth itself, a sense that all this growth was leading somewhere, building towards something she didn't yet understand. She'd wake at 3 in the morning with her heart pounding, feeling called to the garden, though she couldn't say why. She'd stand in the darkness among the plants, the air thick with the scent of tomato vines and basil, feeling the land breathing beneath her feet, waiting, preparing, reaching towards some culmination. In Eleanor's journal, there was a passage Margaret had marked and returned to often. The land gives endlessly, but it also asks, not for sacrifice, but for evolution. To truly partner with the earth means allowing it to change you, to teach you, to show you what you're capable of becoming. I sense I'm approaching something, a threshold. The garden grows more vibrantly each year, not because I'm getting better at farming, but because I'm getting better at listening, better at receiving what the land is trying to show me. The entry after that one was written 3 months later, and it simply said, "I understand now. I finally understand what this land wanted me to learn. But Eleanor never explained what she'd understood. The journal entries after that spoke only of practical matters: harvest yields, weather, daily tasks. As if the revelation had been too large or too private to write down, or perhaps simply beyond the reach of words. Margaret wondered if she was approaching that same threshold. If the months of attention and devotion were leading her toward understanding something Eleanor had found. The thought excited and frightened her in equal measure. She'd come to this farm expecting to die, or at least to survive diminished. She hadn't expected transformation. She hadn't expected to find herself walking towards something vast and strange, something that required her to shed the person she'd been and become someone else entirely. "Show me," she whispered to the earth one night, standing barefoot in the garden under a sky thick with stars. "If there's something more I need to see, I'm ready. Show me what Eleanor found." The land pulsed beneath her feet, just once, but unmistakable. And Margaret knew, with the certainty of prophecy or madness, that the answer was coming. That everything until now had been preparation. That the real work was about to begin. August arrived burning, the sun hammering down on the garden with relentless intensity. Margaret worked in the early mornings and late evenings, avoiding the midday heat that could kill as surely as winter frost. The plants thrived despite the temperature, their roots driven deep by months of devoted attention, their leaves broad and vibrant. She harvested constantly now, bushels of tomatoes, beans by the armload, squash that required both hands to lift. Her small root cellar overflowed. She sold to everyone who asked, gave away what she couldn't sell, still had more than one person could possibly use. But abundance wasn't the point anymore. Somewhere along the way, feeding herself had become secondary to something larger. The relationship itself, the daily communion with earth and growth, and the patient presence she'd learned to sense beneath her feet. She was learning a language older than words, a way of knowing that bypassed intellect entirely. When she walked the garden, she could feel which plants needed water before checking the soil. She could sense past problems days before they became visible. She knew when to harvest, not by calendar, but by something that felt like conversation, the plant itself telling her when it was ready to give. Claire noticed. "You've changed," she said one evening as they worked together pulling weeds. "When you first came here, you were, forgive me, you were like a ghost, moving but not quite alive. Now you're—" She struggled for words. "You're present, fully here." Margaret paused, considering. It was true. The hollowness that had consumed her after David's death had filled somehow, not with forgetting, but with purpose deeper than the personal. She still missed him, still woke sometimes expecting to feel him beside her, but the grief no longer threatened to dissolve her. She was held by something now, rooted as deeply as the plants she tended. "The land gave me back to myself," she said finally. "It took my attention, my grief, everything I poured into it, and it gave me back something to live for." That night, Margaret dreamed. She stood in the garden under a sky that was somehow both day and night, stars visible alongside the sun. The earth beneath her feet was breathing, not metaphorically, but actually rising and falling in a slow rhythm like lungs. She looked down and saw roots spreading from her feet, diving into the soil, branching and spreading until they connected with every plant, every tree, extending beyond her plot to touch the entire property, the neighboring farms, reaching out and out until she was connected to everything growing within miles. The sensation was overwhelming. She could feel through thousands of roots simultaneously, experiencing soil moisture and nutrient availability and the slow, patient work of decomposition all at once. But more than that, she felt the consciousness within the earth itself, vast and old and utterly different from human thought. It didn't think in words or images, but in relationships, in connections, in the slow vocabulary of growth and decay and transformation. And it was trying to tell her something. She woke, gasping, her hands clenched in the sheets, her body slick with sweat. The dream lingered with unusual persistence, refusing to fade the way dreams normally did. She could still feel the ghost of roots extending from her feet, still sense that vast awareness trying to communicate across the unbridgeable gap between human and earth. Eleanor had experienced this. Margaret was suddenly certain. This was the threshold the journal had hinted at, not better farming technique, but a fundamental shift in perception, a way of experiencing the world that most people had forgotten was possible. Indigenous peoples had known it, she thought. Mystics and saints had touched it. Eleanor had found it here in the desperate attempt to survive. And now it was offering itself to Margaret, asking if she was willing to cross over completely. She got dressed and walked outside, though it was barely dawn. The garden lay silver with dew, the plants heavy with ripening fruit. She walked to the center of the plot, the exact spot where she'd unearthed Eleanor's box all those months ago, and knelt. She placed her palms flat against the soil, still dream-sensitized, and tried to quiet her mind enough to hear what the land had been trying to say. At first, nothing. Then, slowly an impression, depth. The sense of layers beneath layers, of roots going down farther than she'd imagined, reaching towards something hidden. The dream had been showing her truth. Roots from her garden did spread far beyond its borders, invisible but real, mycorrhizal networks connecting plant to plant, tree to tree, creating a web of chemical communication science was only beginning to understand. But there was something more, something the dream had been pointing toward, something buried deep. Margaret grabbed a shovel and began to dig. She dug in the center of the plot, where her hands were pressed, working slowly, carefully, aware she was operating on dream logic and faith. 3 feet down, the shovel hit something that wasn't stone. She cleared the dirt away with shaking hands and revealed a second box, identical to the first. Her heart hammered. She lifted it free, brushed away the clinging earth, opened the rusted clasp. Inside, another journal, this one older, the leather cracked and brittle. She opened it with extreme care, terrified the pages would crumble. The handwriting was different from Eleanor's, masculine, precise, faded to near illegibility. She could just make out the name on the first page, Jonathan Ashford, and a date, 1847. Eleanor's father? Grandfather? Margaret carried the journal inside, hands trembling, and began the painstaking work of reading it. Many pages were damaged beyond recovery, but enough remained to piece together a story that made her understanding of this land shift again, revealing new depths. Jonathan Ashford had been an agricultural reformer, obsessed with soil health and sustainable practices decades before such concepts had names. He'd purchased this land in 1846, drawn by rumors that it had once been incredibly fertile before some unnamed disaster had rendered it barren. The indigenous peoples who lived here before displacement tell stories, he wrote. They say this was sacred ground, a place where the boundary between earth and spirit was thin. But during the wars of removal, something terrible happened here. Blood was spilled on sacred ground. The earth itself revolted, refusing to give life as punishment for the violation. Jonathan had been skeptical of such stories, dismissing them as superstition. But when every crop he planted failed, when the soil seemed to actively resist his efforts, he begun to wonder. He tried everything science of his era could suggest. Nothing worked. In desperation, he'd sought out the remaining indigenous people in the region, asking what could be done to heal land that had been desecrated. They told me the earth holds memory, he wrote. That land wounded by violence remains wounded until someone acknowledges the harm, offers healing, makes amends. They described ceremonies I barely understood. Smoke and singing, offerings made, words spoken to the land itself, asking forgiveness. I thought them primitive, but I had no other options left. Jonathan had attempted his own version of those ceremonies, translating them through his Christian understanding into something that felt less foreign to him. Prayers asking the land's forgiveness, offerings of his own blood mixed with water and poured into the soil, days spent in what he called contemplation, but might have been meditation. I do not know if I'm doing it correctly, he wrote. I only know I must try. This land has suffered. If there is any truth to what I've been told, it deserves acknowledgement of that suffering, deserves healing as surely as any wounded creature. His efforts had produced minimal results. Small patches where things grew slightly better, brief periods of improvement followed by relapse. He died in 1852, passing the land to his daughter Eleanor with a note Margaret found pressed between the journal's final pages. The land is wounded, but not dead. I've done what I could, but I think it needs more than one lifetime to heal. Perhaps you'll find a way. The earth speaks to those who listen. Learn to hear it. Margaret sat with both journals in her lap, understanding cascading through her. This land had been wounded, not just depleted of nutrients, but traumatized by violence, by the displacement and slaughter of the people who'd known how to live with it properly. That wound had persisted, preventing growth, creating the barrenness everyone attributed to poor soil. Jonathan had begun the healing, but hadn't finished it. Eleanor had continued the work, had learned to give the land the attention and relationship it craved. And now, 150 years later, Margaret was being asked to complete something that had been started by people she'd never met, part of a healing that spanned generations. She understood now why the land had responded to her grief. It recognized suffering. It responded to witness. Everything Eleanor had done, the attention, the speaking to seeds, the barefoot walking, the offerings had been instinctive healing practice, ways of saying to wounded earth, I see you. I acknowledge what was done to you. I'm here now. You're not alone. And the land, slowly, across decades, across lifetimes, had begun to heal, had begun to remember how to give life, had begun to trust again. Margaret wept, understanding the weight of what she'd stumbled into. She thought she was just trying to survive, to grow food, to give her grief somewhere to go. But she'd been participating in something far larger, a multi-generational act of healing, a restoration of relationship between human and earth that had been shattered by violence and neglect. I understand, she said aloud, to Eleanor, to Jonathan, to the land itself. I understand what you've been trying to show me. She spent the rest of August in focused devotion, not just tending the garden, but learning to expand her awareness. She practiced the state she'd touched in her dream, the sense of being connected to everything growing, of feeling through roots, of experiencing the world as relationship rather than separation. It was difficult, like learning a new language or training muscles that had never been used. But gradually, with persistence, she found she could touch that state more easily, could walk the garden and feel what each plant needed without checking, could place her hands on soil and sense the invisible network of life beneath, could stand at the property's edge and feel the slow pulse of healing moving through the land like blood through veins. The garden responded. Growth that had been remarkable became supernatural. Tomatoes ripened to the size of grapefruits, their taste so intense it was almost overwhelming. Beans produced until their vines were heavy to breaking. Flowers bloomed with colors that seemed to vibrate at the edge of what eyes could process. People came from farther and farther away, drawn by rumors of the miracle garden, and Margaret sold produce, taught methods, shared Eleanor's story. Some dismissed it as nonsense, but others, enough others, understood. They took the teaching back to their own land, began their own practice of attention and relationship. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the healing was spreading. In September, on the anniversary of her arrival, Margaret planted a tree. An apple tree, grafted and 2 years old, its roots wrapped in burlap from the nursery. She dug the hole herself despite the labor, despite the heat, wanting to do it properly. Before placing the tree, she sat at the edge of the hole and spoke to the land, to Eleanor, to Jonathan, to the indigenous people whose names she didn't know, but whose suffering had wounded this ground. I can't undo what was done, she said. I can't bring back the people who were killed or displaced. I can't erase the violence, but I can acknowledge it. I can tell you that I see the harm, that I'm sorry, that I want to be part of healing rather than continued harm. This tree is my promise to keep doing this work, to keep giving you attention and relationship, to keep passing this knowledge forward until the land is fully healed. She planted the tree with ceremony, mixing her tears with water before pouring it on the roots, speaking words of encouragement and hope to the sapling. Grow strong, she told it. Sink roots deep. Connect with everything already here. Be part of the healing. The tree seemed to settle into the ground with an almost audible sigh, its leaves catching the September light, and Margaret felt that pulse again, the land responding, accepting, grateful. That night, she had the dream again. But this time, when her roots spread out, connecting to everything, she felt not just plants but people. Claire and her children, the old man from the feed store, others she'd taught, strangers she'd never met who'd heard the story and begun their own practice. All of them connected, all of them part of a healing network spreading wider with each season. She saw how it would continue to grow, how what Eleanor and Jonathan had started would spread beyond this farm, would teach people to remember relationship with the earth, would slowly, over generations, help heal what had been broken. She woke knowing what Eleanor had known, that the work would never be finished, not in one lifetime or 10. But that didn't matter. What mattered was doing the work anyway, giving what you could give, trusting that others would continue after you were gone. What mattered was remembering that healing was possible, that attention was powerful, that relationship with the living earth was not primitive superstition, but essential truth. She was part of something larger than herself. That knowledge was both humbling and elevating, a weight and a gift. She'd come here desperate and alone, and she'd found purpose beyond survival, connection beyond the personal. She'd found what everyone was looking for, whether they knew it or not. The sense that your life meant something, that your presence mattered, that you were part of a story larger than your individual suffering. The land had given her that. In return, she would give it the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. It seemed like a fair trade. More than fair. It seemed like grace. October brought frost earlier than expected, silver mornings when the gardens sparkled with crystalline beauty. Margaret woke one morning to find her breath visible in the bedroom, the farmhouse cold despite the wood stove she'd kept burning through the night. She dressed quickly, layers against the chill, and went outside to check the tender plants. The garden was transformed. Ice sheeted every leaf and stem, turning the familiar landscape into something alien and magical. She walked the rows slowly, checking for damage, expecting to find the tomatoes blackened, the beans collapsed. But everything lived. The ice was melting already in the early sun, dripping from leaves that remained green and vital. Something in the soil itself had protected them, some warmth rising from deep below, some gift the land was giving in return for the months of attention. She stood in the center of the plot, the exact spot where she'd found both Eleanor's journal and Jonathan's, and felt the presence she'd been learning to sense. But this morning it was different, stronger, more insistent, as if the land had something urgent to communicate. Margaret knelt and placed both palms flat against the cold earth. She closed her eyes, quieted her breathing, opened herself to whatever wanted to be known. At first, the usual sense of connection, roots spreading, awareness expanding, the feeling of being part of rather than separate from. But then something more, a pull, directional, specific. The land was showing her where to dig. Not here in the garden. Deeper into the property, past the field she'd been gradually restoring, toward the far corner where old-growth trees still stood, survivors from when this land had been forest. She'd rarely walked there, focusing her energy on the cultivated areas. But now she felt called with undeniable force. She grabbed a shovel and walked, following the pull like a compass needle drawn to true north. The sensation strengthened as she moved, became almost physical, a warmth in her chest that intensified when she moved in the right direction. She entered the stand of old trees, oak and maple, their trunks thick as her torso, their branches interlacing overhead. The ground here was thick with fallen leaves, undisturbed for decades. The pull stopped her at the base of the largest oak, its bark deeply furrowed, its crown spreading wide above. This tree was ancient, had been here long before the farm, before the displacement, before Jonathan or Eleanor or any of the suffering that had wounded this ground. It had witnessed everything. Margaret knelt at its base and began to dig. The leaf litter came away easily, then harder packed earth beneath. She dug carefully, sensing this required reverence, that she was being shown something sacred. 2 feet down, her shovel struck something that was not tree root. She cleared the soil with her hands, heart pounding, and revealed a stone. But not a natural stone. This had been shaped, carved, marked with symbols she didn't recognize, but that pulled at something deep in her awareness. She worked it free, lifting it with both hands. It was heavy, the size of a large book, its surface covered in markings that might have been language, or might have been art, or might have been something that transcended that distinction. She sat back with the stone in her lap, and the moment her hands fully touched it, something opened. Not vision exactly, not memory, but direct knowledge, pouring into her consciousness like water into an empty vessel. She saw, felt, understood this land as it had been before the wound. Saw the people who had lived here for thousands of years, who had known how to be in relationship with the earth, who had honored the life beneath their feet, who had understood what modern people had forgotten. That land was not resource but relation, not thing but being, not dead matter but living presence. She saw the violation. Soldiers coming, violence erupting, blood soaking into ground that had been kept sacred. She felt the earth's shock, its betrayal, its decision to withdraw rather than participate in further harm. Felt it close down, refuse to give, become the barren place everyone had known. But she also saw the healing. Saw Jonathan's first awkward attempts, his prayers that didn't quite know what they were praying to, but were sincere enough to matter. Saw Eleanor learning to listen, to give attention, to remember practices her culture had dismissed as primitive. Saw her own arrival, her grief finding purpose, her desperate attention becoming devotion. And she saw what would come. More people learning, more land healing, the remembering spreading like roots through soil, connecting, strengthening, restoring what had been broken. The stone was a marker, she understood. A blessing placed by the people who'd been driven away, a promise that healing was possible, that the land could forgive if someone finally learned to ask properly. Jonathan had never found it. Eleanor had sensed it, but hadn't needed to unearth it. But Margaret was being shown because the healing had reached a threshold, because 3 generations of work had finally accumulated enough to allow the full restoration. What the land wanted now, she understood with crystalline clarity, was not just relationship with one person or one family. It wanted to be template, demonstration, proof. It wanted people to come here and see what was possible, to learn what could happen when humans remembered how to be in proper relationship with Earth. It wanted to teach. Margaret stood, cradling the stone, tears streaming down her face. She understood now what her purpose was, why she'd been called here, why she'd found Eleanor's journal exactly when she did. She was meant to open this place, to share it, to create a space where the teaching could spread as widely as possible. Not just a farm, but a school, a demonstration site, a place of remembering and restoration. Yes, she said aloud to the land, to the ancient oak, to the stone in her hands. I understand. I'll do it. I'll give whatever time I have left to making this happen. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a surge of warmth that started in the ground beneath her feet and rose through her body like a wave, filling every cell, every space where grief had hollowed her out. It felt like being loved by something vast and patient and eternal. Felt like coming home after being lost for so long she'd forgotten home existed. Felt like the answer to every question she'd never known how to ask. She stood there weeping in the presence of the ancient tree, holding the sacred stone, feeling herself held by something that had been waiting across generations for someone willing to do this work. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that everything, David's death, her poverty, her desperate arrival at this failed farm, every moment of suffering and doubt, had been leading her to this moment. Not because suffering had purpose, but because she transformed suffering into purpose, had alchemized grief into attention, had let her brokenness become doorway to something larger than herself. The widow they'd given a failing farm had found what she'd unearthed in the soil. Not treasure in any conventional sense, but something infinitely more valuable. She'd found relationship, purpose, connection to a story that began before her, and would continue after. She'd found the living presence most people spent their entire lives not noticing, the consciousness beneath their feet that responded when finally given attention. She'd found what Eleanor and Jonathan had found. The truth that Earth was alive, that relationship was possible, that healing was the work and the way and the gift all at once. And in finding it, she'd found herself restored, not to who she'd been, but to who she'd always had the potential to become. Someone who could stand in sacred presence without flinching. Someone who could receive the Earth's teaching and pass it forward. Someone who could transform the final chapter of her life from ending into beginning. She carried the stone back to the farmhouse, placed it on the kitchen table beside Eleanor's journal and Jonathan's, 3 artifacts of 3 generations of healing. And she began to write, not a journal this time, but a plan. A vision for what this place could become. A school of remembering. A center for teaching relationship with land. A demonstration that what modern culture had forgotten could be recovered, practiced, passed on. She would need help. She would need funding. She would need people willing to believe what seemed impossible. But she'd made impossible things grow in dead soil. She'd learned to hear the earth speaking. She'd crossed the threshold Eleanor had hinted at and found it led not to an ending, but to a beginning so vast she could barely glimpse its edges. The widow had been given a failing farm, but what she'd unearthed in the soil, connection, purpose, the living presence beneath all things, that changed everything. Changed her. Changed the land. And if she could help others remember what she'd learned, it would change the world, one person, one plot, one relationship at a time. Outside, the sun broke fully through the clouds, and for the first time since David's death, Margaret looked at the light falling on her garden and felt something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite joy, but contained elements of both. The sense that life could surprise you, that endings could become beginnings, that even in the deepest grief, seeds were waiting to sprout. All they needed was someone willing to notice, to attend, to give them the attention that allowed life to remember itself. She'd found what Eleanor had found. She'd completed what Jonathan started. And now it was her turn to plant seeds for generations not yet born, to be part of the healing that continued, to give what she'd received so freely to anyone willing to learn. The land beneath Thornfield Farm pulsed with life, with memory, with gratitude. And Margaret Hayes, the widow who'd arrived here to die, stood in her kitchen planning to teach the world how to live. Spring returned with the inevitability of all true things. Margaret stood at the same rusted gate where she'd arrived 18 months earlier, but everything had transformed, the land, and herself most of all. The field that had been pale, as ash now rolled away in shades of green, so vivid they seemed to pulse with their own light. The farmhouse behind her had been repaired, expanded, made ready to receive the students who'd been applying since word of her work had begun to spread. Claire had moved into the second bedroom, bringing her children, all of them learning to hear what the earth was trying to say. The old man from the feed store had donated supplies, quietly telling her he'd felt something change when he stood in her garden, something that made him remember his own grandfather's farm before industrial agriculture had convinced everyone that chemicals were wisdom and relationship was sentiment. She thought about Eleanor often, wondered if the woman could have imagined this continuation of her work, wondered if Jonathan, in his desperation and doubt, could have envisioned that his first awkward attempts at healing would bear fruit more than a century later. She hoped they could somehow see it, somehow know that what they'd started had not died with them, but had only been waiting for the right hands to pick up the work and carry it forward. That was the consolation and the responsibility of being part of something larger than yourself. Your individual life mattered less than the thread you wove into the larger pattern, the seeds you planted for forever you'd never see grown. The apple tree she'd planted had survived the winter, was budding now with promise of fruit. She visited it each morning, standing with her palm pressed to its trunk, feeling the life moving through it, the water rising from roots to branches, the patient work of growth that required no forcing, only attention and time. It had become her meditation, this daily attendance, and she'd begun teaching others to find their own version, the place and practice that connected them most fully to the living world, that reminded them they were part of rather than separate from. On the morning of the spring equinox, she gathered the first group of students in the garden. 12 people ranging from 19 to 73, from cities and suburbs and other failing farms, all of them drawn by the same hunger that had driven her here. She looked at their faces, saw her own desperation reflected back, and knew exactly what to say because Eleanor and Jonathan had said it to her across the barrier of death and time. She'd come here to survive and discovered something better than survival: purpose. She'd come here to die and discovered something stronger than death: continuity. She'd come here with nothing and found everything that actually mattered. Not possessions or security or the future she'd thought she'd wanted, but this, standing in the presence of the living earth, feeling it respond to her attention, knowing she was part of its healing and it was part of hers, understanding at last what it meant to be truly alive in a world that was itself alive and had only been waiting for someone to remember.